Hi guys, today we are going to get started with our fourth unit, and this is our Ancient Middle East unit. Today we're going to start talking about the Conquerors. Now, these three groups we're talking about were not related other than the fact that they were able to gain territory through warfare. So we'll be starting today with the Hittites, who we talked about before. So the Hittites are going to create their empire in 1650 BCE. So we're going back in time from our last unit. The Hittites were descendants of the Indo-Europeans who had settled in Anatolia. The Indo-Europeans were from the steppe in Central Asia. They had been nomads and warriors. Another group of Indo-Europeans that we've talked about were the Aryans who settled in India. The Hittites were known for their fierce army. They were the first to use iron weapons. They also had fast, lightweight chariots. They would go on to conquer Anatolia, which we also know as Turkey today. They conquer Syria and other parts of Mesopotamia. They're also known for their law code. Their law code was less harsh than that of Hammurabi's code. And when you would go on to commit a crime, instead of forfeiting your life or body parts like an eye or a hand, you would instead pay a fine. The Hittites began their empire in Anatolia. We also call it Asia Minor, and again Turkey. You need to know all three of the names for this region. We talked about them when we covered Egypt during the New Kingdom. The Hittites would fight against the Egyptians at the Battle of Kadesh. They were each trying to claim land on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And they fought Egypt to a draw. So they came up with a peace treaty instead of continuing the fight, where they promised to be brothers forever. As they continued to conquer, they would take hold of Mesopotamia and they would blend their culture with the Mesopotamians. What's our special word, or two words, that mean we are going to exchange goods and ideas? And we should be thinking cultural diffusion. Here we've got a picture showing us the Great Temple at the Hittite capital, Hattusis, which is in Turkey. So looking at this map, the dark red area is where the Hittite Empire began, including the capital of Hattusis. The lighter red or pinkish area is where they would expand their empire to. And if we look right here, we see Kadesh, and that's where they would fight the Egyptian army. And you can see that instead of continuing to fight, they divided the territory in half. Here we have the Hittite war machine. The horses would pull the chariot with soldiers on the chariot into battle, and they would use bow and arrow to fight against their enemies. This was actually transferred from a carving onto paper, and then it was colored. And you can see the artwork isn't all that great just yet. In the ancient world, they struggled to show 3 dimensions. So when we have these horses here, it's very hard to tell that there are 3 of them, and we can't even tell how many legs they have. In the bottom picture, we've got our iron weapons that the Hittites would be using. Again, they were one of the first groups to use iron weapons. The next group we're going to talk about are the Assyrians. And they're going to come to power in 850 BCE. They originally came from northern Mesopotamia, which was an area with very few natural barriers. And they were bullied by the groups around them. And over time, they themselves became a ruthless people due to their long history of warfare. They pretty much said they weren't going to be bullied anymore, and instead they created a highly advanced military using new weapon technology, and it would allow them to take over a large area of the Middle East and Egypt. And it was warfare that made a leader great in Assyrian society. we have King Sennacherib, and he bragged that he had destroyed 89 cities and over 820 villages. So this was a society where might makes right. The more ruthless you are, the stronger you are, that's what's going to give you a great reputation. The Assyrians began in northern Mesopotamia, but they would eventually conquer all of the Fertile Crescent and extend their empire south towards the Arabian Desert. They would even conquer Egypt. They were part of a long line of empires who had conquered Egypt. Why would we want to conquer Egypt? What does Egypt have that all of these different empires want a piece of? And you should be thinking, the Egyptians have the Nile River, and therefore they are able to produce lots of food. The Nile was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, and that's why so many different groups wanted to control Egypt. Egypt gave them food. The Assyrian army was very well organized, and all the soldiers were well equipped. They used iron weapons, which was the best metal that could be used at this time. The soldiers would wear leather armor. Attached to the armor would be metal scales. They had copper or iron helmets, a padded loincloth to protect you below the belt. They wore leather skirts, which would also have metal scales. It would allow them to move but still protect them. Their shields were made of wooden planks, and then the front would be covered in metal. And they would use chariots like the other groups around them. Here we have the Assyrian war chariot. It was bigger than that of the Hittites. It was pulled by more horses, and we could have more soldiers in the chariot itself. So if you were on the other side of the battlefield and you're standing there and all of these chariots come racing forward at you, your likely move is to turn around and run, because you against a horse, you're going to lose that one pretty much every time. The Assyrians were not all about mindless battle and bloodshed. They were almost scientific about their military campaigns. They would use engineers to build bridges. They had special workers called sappers. When they came up against a defended city, they would lay siege to the city by sending these sappers into tunnels, which they would dig underneath the walls, and it would compromise the structure of the wall, and the wall would fall down and collapse, and that would allow the Assyrian army access to the inside of the fortress. They had foot soldiers, but their officers, those in command, were cavalrymen, meaning they rode on horseback. And that was so they could get around the battlefield more efficiently to tell the other units the command. They also used battering rams to break down city walls. This is not a tank, even though it kind of looks like it. It's a toy trying to show the Assyrian battering ram. This would have been a wooden beam, probably sharpened on one end to knock down a wall to a fortress. If you decided to fight against the Assyrians, you would be granted absolutely no mercy. The Assyrians would come to your city, and if you decided to fight back against them, when you lost, you could count on being killed or enslaved. And if you were enslaved, you would be moved to a new area away from your homeland so that you couldn't rebel again. The idea was that they would put different people from all different parts of their empire in new areas together so that they wouldn't be able to communicate with each other. They wouldn't have anything in common, and it would make it much harder for them to rebel against the Assyrians. So if you fought back against the Assyrians, they would burn down your city, and the people would be tortured. They would impale them, which is a slow process of killing them by sticking a spear or spike through their body and leaving them posted up around the city. We can see that in this depiction here. It was also made famous by Vlad Dracula, who would go on to become the character Dracula in Bram Stoker's novel. They would also skin you alive. They would boil you a little bit first to make your skin nice and soft before cutting it off while you were still alive. And if you were lucky, they would just behead you, and they would stack the heads outside of the walls of the cities as a warning to others. Women and children were not spared either. So the goal was to terrorize the region they were trying to conquer. When they destroyed the city, they might let one person go to tell the other cities, hey, the Assyrians are coming, we're not going to fight back. And if you didn't fight back and you turned over your city to them, you paid them tribute, you gave up, you would be spared. You would just be under Assyrian rule. Between 850 and 650 BCE, remember time works backwards in BCE, the Assyrians took over Babylonia, which was in Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine, which were along the coast of the Mediterranean. They took over parts of Anatolia, and they took over Egypt. The Assyrians would reach their height around 650 BCE. That's when their empire was at its largest. Despite what you might think, they actually ruled well and often fairly. The Assyrian kings would choose local rulers loyal to them to govern their own areas called provinces. Kind of like how we divide the United States up into states and we have governors. They would pick someone from that region to rule who was loyal to the king. So this governor would report to the king and the king's advisors on all the goings-on of his province. The more land the Assyrians captured meant the more taxes and riches that they could take from the people living there. And that paid to build an even bigger and stronger army, along with public works, like roads and temples, bathhouses, and so forth. So this was kind of like a cycle. They would build a bigger army, take over more land, and use what they took from the conquered territory to build an even bigger army. They built roads. Roads helped to protect merchants. They were able to build stations along the way full of guardsmen. So you were safe along the Assyrian roads. And the threat of an Assyrian invasion forced most people to pay up before the Assyrians actually burned their city to the ground and slaughtered the inhabitants of the city. The capital city of the Assyrian Empire was Nineveh. You need to write that down somewhere. You'll need to remember it for the test. Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrians. It was located on the Tigris River and had been established by King Sennacherib. Nineveh was a walled city. The city itself was 3 miles long and 1 mile wide and was the largest city in the world at its time. In the city, you could find sculptures and other artwork, elaborate pottery. So when the Assyrians weren't at war, they would sometimes be found making art. But of course, most of the art was focused on warfare and their other favorite pastime, hunting lions. Because if you can't hunt people, hunting lions is about the next best thing you can do. They hunted other animals besides lions. What do we think this big bird right here is? Probably 2 choices that we're thinking of. Yep, it is an ostrich. Here we have our Assyrian carrying a knife. The ostrich looks like he's in fear. Our other big bird, not the one from Sesame Street, would be the emu, but they were located in Australia. And next year, hopefully your teacher will go over the Great Emu War, where the emu actually defeated the Australians. The Australians were trying to get rid of the emu, but they failed to do so. Therefore, the emu were the victors. This is the sculpture you would be greeted with as you entered the city. We've got the body of a bull, wings of an eagle, and the face of a man. Quite the epic beard he's got going on there. One of the things they did was they made it so no matter how you looked at it, it actually looked three-dimensional. If you look at it from the front, you would see that it has two front legs, and you would figure, well, the other legs are behind it. When you looked at it from the side, you would actually not see this leg here. It would be behind the front leg. And then it looks like it has 1, 2, 3, 4 legs. So they were pretty creative with their artwork. For a ruthless and bloodthirsty empire, their capital, Nineveh, actually housed one of the world's largest and oldest libraries. King Ashurbanipal collected more than 20,000 clay tablets from around the Middle East to put in this library. And this is where we found the Epic of Gilgamesh from the older Sumer civilization. And this library was organized into rooms according to subject. What do we have to organize our libraries? What system do we use? We use the Dewey Decimal System. Now, back in my day, up until probably middle school, when we wanted to find a book, we had to use the old card catalogs. You guys probably didn't have to do that. We'd actually have to look up the subject to find books about it and pull out a card with a number on it and use that to figure out where the book was. But probably about the time I got into middle school, we had computers that would do that for us, and it made life much easier. Here we have a recreation of the walls of Nineveh. We can see just how tall and thick the walls were to prevent others from laying siege to the city. And we can see the fashion of an Assyrian priest and a king. Beards were all the rage back then. If you didn't have a strong beard game, you were looked down upon. The Assyrians will decline and eventually fall. King Ashurbanipal will die in 612 BCE. He was the last strong Assyrian ruler. And at that point, groups who had been conquered by the Assyrians would begin to rise up. They had resented Assyrian rule and would now try to overthrow the empire. These groups were the Chaldeans and the Medes, and they would work together to burn Nineveh to the ground. Some clay tablets survived the fire and the looting, like the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Chaldeans would take over the Assyrian Empire. The Chaldeans would begin their own empire, and we also know them as the New Babylonians. That's because their capital city was at Babylon. We'll talk about the Medes next class. They're from northern Iran, and they will eventually be incorporated into the Persian Empire. The Chaldeans were descendants of Hammurabi's people. Hammurabi, who had been the king, and his capital was Babylon. The Chaldeans would reach their height of power under King Nebuchadnezzar. They would go on to conquer Syria and Judah on the Mediterranean coast. They would restore the city of Babylon to its glory. They would build a tower 300 feet tall. The walls went around the city for 11 miles. They were very thick and could stop sieges. And they had enough food in the city to last 4 years in case there was a siege. A siege is when the opposing army would surround the city and not let any food in or out. The Chaldeans, under King Nebuchadnezzar, also built the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And this was built for Nebuchadnezzar's wife. She had come from an area that had a more tropical climate with lots of plant life. Babylon, being in the desert, did not have that, so he wanted to make his wife happy, so he had these gardens constructed, and they were one of the ancient wonders of the world. The Chaldean or New Babylonian Empire looked a lot like the Assyrian Empire. They pretty much took over the same territory that had been controlled by the Assyrians. And that includes Egypt as well. So they took over 2 of our 4 early river valley civilizations. They took over Egypt and they controlled Mesopotamia. Here we have Nebuchadnezzar. He's deep in thought, scratching his beard, thinking, what can I do to keep my wife happy? So he decides to build the Hanging Gardens of Babylon for his wife. Now, we don't actually know what it would have looked like. We've got different artists try to depict it in different ways. So here's one depiction. Again, they would have flowing water in order to keep the vegetation alive in the middle of the desert. But we think it probably looked more like this. Okay, some sort of palace complex with lots of vegetation growing off on the sides. It was called the Hanging Gardens because it looked like it was hanging or floating in the middle of the desert. And if you've ever been out in the summer and been on the blacktop, it kind of looks like you've got the heat waves rising up. So it almost creates like a mirage effect. So that's what people would be looking at when they saw the Hanging Gardens of Babylon from the distance. Here is another artist's interpretation of the Hanging Gardens. We think that this in the background, and we saw it in our last slide as well, might have been the tower that they were referring to that was built in Babylon. Of course, it doesn't look quite like a tower, more like a what that we've seen in Sumer. Now you should be thinking ziggurat or step pyramid. Here we have some depictions of the city, like the Hanging Gardens in the top right of the screen. A possibility of what the tower could have looked like. This is the Ishtar Gate on the bottom left. This would lead you into the city from the north side, and it is actually in a museum in Berlin, Germany. And it's much bigger than what it looks like in this picture. Finally, the bottom right, we've got a depiction of the entire city. The Chaldeans, or Babylonians, would eventually be conquered by the Persian Empire, which we will spend the entirety of our next day of notes talking about.